Hello, is this working? Jim? Jim, is this working? Yes, it is working. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry to be the Grinch and break up the social. Whoops, we've got a. Yeah, well, we have a table that's shaky that may be representative of some of us as well. Anyway, I'm sorry to break up the socializing, but hopefully there'll be plenty more time to do that this morning. But we would like to get started because we have a very busy agenda. Welcome to everyone. I am Carol Peasley, one of the co-chairs of the UAA, along with TButler, who is sitting here in the front row, and Tish will be up here shortly. But I drew the short straw and have to start the process. We look forward to another very interesting annual general meeting and are delighted that you all are here. And the U includes a number of specially invited guests, including some young professionals from USAID who will join us for much of the day. We welcome all of you. I might add that about 50 young professionals asked to be able to come to participate in the sessions today, and we asked them to kind of split it up morning and afternoon. And there'll be more people coming as it's going to be a very fluid day with people coming and going. Because the annual general meeting, the AGM, is a business meeting, we would like to take a few minutes to report back to our members. Announcements for the AGM did include a link to the formal report that details 2016 activities and preliminary 2017 plans. It is posted on the UAA website, and we hope you will read it and provide us with your thoughts on future priorities. To help you do that, we will send out a separate survey in January asking for your views. Once we hear from you, final 2017 plans and budget will be put in place. We think you will be impressed by the activities in 2016 detailed in the online report, including continued increase in members. As of September 30th, there were 302 contributing members, and I suspect that number is higher today as some of you made late 2016 contributions. And this exceeds our goal of 300 for the year and puts us well on the way for a higher target in 2017. We thank all of the committee's members who made 2016 so successful. This also gives us a view that everything the UAA does is the result of work by volunteer members. We hope more of you will offer to work with the committees in the coming year, and success really does depend on it. While cajoling more of you to step up to help do the UAA's work, we would also like to ask one additional favor. The growing number of contributing members is obviously a very good thing. It enables us to provide greater service and also to cover our costs for things like this AGM, social gatherings, and even mundane items such as insurance. But, and here is the ask, we will be able to operate more effectively if annual contributions are made in the first 2 months of the calendar year. We will try to make that clear when we send out our reminder message in January. Please help us by contributing in January and February. We also want to announce that the board has just approved a special membership category to include that longtime spouses and or partners of UAA members who are no longer with us will be able to continue their relationship with the association. Look for information on this soon on the website. Now to a very brief summary of highlights from the past year. First, the Public Outreach Committee facilitated a USAID conducted web-based training session on current USAID priorities and media tips for alumni interested in public speaking. The committee is also working with USAID's LPA Bureau to reach out to alumni located in Atlanta, Georgia, and Los Angeles, California, where 2 USAID positions have been located to help USAID with recruitment and outreach. The bibliography, alumni publications, has been updated on an ongoing basis, and the committee arranged speaking opportunities for 4 alumni authors. I should add that this committee needs a new co-chair, so please let us know if you are interested. Please, someone step up to help with that committee. Secondly, the Strengthening USAID Committee worked with AID to evaluate its mentorship program, our mentorship program, which pairs USAID alumni volunteers with officers serving in USAID missions. 3 dozen mentor-mentee pairs were active in 2016, and a new mentoring cohort will begin in November. Please see Jerry Wood, Jose Garzon, or David Cohen to become a mentor or a committee member. Third, the Development Issues Committee organized an array of interesting presentations and discussions on international development, primarily at Dakar House, but also in collaboration with the Wilson Center and IFPRI. The committee's Perspectives section on the website continues to enable members to submit short essays and to comment on development issues. The committee also organized a number of book group sessions that were very well attended. And please see Jim Fox or Steve Giddings to join this committee. Fourth, the Membership Committee continued to bring new members to the UAA and to sponsor social activities in the winter, spring, and summer. Also, as noted earlier, they created the new associate member category. The committee also reduced the recommended contribution level for alumni living outside of the DC area. That doesn't mean you should all move now. Please see Nancy Tumovic or Frank Almaguer with ideas on expanding membership, particularly of former FSNs and non-foreign service alumni. We want to make sure we're a very inclusive organization. Fifth, the Finance and Administration Committee has continued to strengthen UAA systems, including management of the legal reporting and insurance requirements that we have as a registered nonprofit organization. Use of the website has increased by about 20% over last year. Ven Suresh continues as our part-time admin assistant, and I hope that you all will speak to Ven today and thank him for the great job he's doing. Ven was out at the registration desk, and he's been a real blessing to us. Please see George Hill or Rob Sonnenthal if you would like to volunteer to help that committee. Also, David Cohen, I'm sure, would appreciate your help with the website. Finally, we created the USAID History Committee this past year. We are still seeking private funding to match the $170,000 pledged by UAA members last year, and would welcome any ideas you all have on possible sources of additional funding. Alex Shakow chairs this committee, and if you would like to learn more about where we are on this and to offer your thoughts on next steps, please see Alex at lunchtime. We've asked him to be available to be able to talk more about this with folks. While disappointed that we are not further along on the history project, we are pleased to announce that USAID just entered into a new cooperative agreement with the Association of Diplomatic Studies and Training, ADST, to conduct over the coming 2 years 50 oral history interviews of USAID alumni. UAA will be working with ADST on this, so stay tuned for more information by email and on the website. And I'm pleased to say that Mark Tauber is here from ADST today, so I hope many of you will have a chance to meet him today. He's the chief interviewer at ADST these days, and a very nice fellow. Now, one last point related to history. Jim Harold of the Development Experience Clearinghouse at USAID has asked us to invite our members to submit old, because we're old, printed and digital documents about USAID that are not already in the historical archives. and to submit them to him for scanning and inclusion, and they can be returned to you, the documents. You received a one-page sheet that was on the table explaining how you can do this, and let me encourage folks to do this. I know I'm cleaning out my basement. I'm sure you all are as well. So if you have documents that would be helpful to aid and the history of USAID, please turn them over to them. Now, Tish Butler, co-chair of the UAA, will be handling later sessions, but until then, I would like to turn things over to Alex Shakow to say a few words about today's AGM, and then we will get started with the substance. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody, and delighted that you are all here today. Excuse me. As you know, the theme of this meeting today is learning from history. As we all played a part in USAID's past, some of us more past than others, we obviously care about history. But the emphasis today is not simply on what happened, but on what we can learn from it. How can the USAID of today and tomorrow build on these lessons? That is one reason we are so pleased that there are so many, or there are going to be so many, of the current USAID staff with us today. It is also the reason, as Carol pointed out, that we're trying to get an independent and objective history of USAID compiled and published. You have in your packet of materials, and I hope you all picked up the agenda and everything else, but in there you will find a one-page status report on where we are on the history project, and as to which I'm very pleased to say many of you have already generously pledged your support. During lunch, as Carol noted, I'd be happy to talk with any of you who have some suggestions about what we might do, would like to help out. Everything from writing it to being able to raise $1 million to fund it. So any of your suggestions would be most welcome. As the agenda indicates, excuse me, we will have plenary sessions all day long today, starting with 2 panels this morning. Immediately after lunch, we will announce the UAA board election results and the winners of the Alumni of the Year awards. USAID Administrator Gail Smith will speak to us at 2:30, and at 3 o'clock there will be a panel of former aid administrators, Peter McPherson, Brian Atwood, and Henrietta Four, and they will be talking about what they learned and what they would like to have learned and what might be useful for the next administration. We always, excuse me, we always try to cram as much, sorry about that. We always try to cram as much as we can into the day, including substantial time for socializing. There's a 30-minute coffee break and a lengthy lunch hour. To save time, introductions will be brief, as you have ample, in this same, you have ample bio data on each of the speakers here today in that package. We also want to be sure to leave time for you to engage with the panelists. Each of our moderators is tasked to ensure that this happens and that they hope to have in each panel about 30 minutes for interaction with you. To make sure we stay on schedule, though, we need your help. After our breaks, please return to this room promptly when called so that we can start off on the next session, plenary session, on time. Thank you in advance for doing so. Our first panel will review approaches to foreign assistance from the earliest days of the Republic through the Marshall Plan. Our second panel will explore several diverse country case studies. As the day goes on, we hope that the relationship between these examples drawn from history and current and future challenges will emerge. Gail Smith's talk and this afternoon's panel of former administrators should further highlight the benefits of analyzing critical parts of our history as a way to better inform future policies and actions. Now it's time to get on with the program. So if I could ask the panelists and to come on up and sit here, please. And Jim, are you? And I guess it doesn't matter which order you sit, please.
Gentlemen.
And while that's going on, I'd like to take the advantage of introducing the moderator, and he will introduce the panelists. But our moderator is Jim Bever, who has spent 34 years in USAID, including leading several of the toughest and most important overseas missions. Looking over his resume, it looks to me as though he's held almost every important job in USAID during these 34 years. And he still looks young and bright.
Don't feel young.
He's currently USAID's Deputy Assistant Administrator for Legislation and Public Affairs, and is a great friend to the USAID Alumni Association. I suspect it won't be too long before he will be eligible, whether he'll take advantage of it, eligible to become a member of the USAID Alumni Association, and we will welcome him with open arms. And I welcome the panel, and Jim, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex.
And we're starting early, which is an extraordinary development.
Yeah, and for those of you who are familiar with AID award ceremonies, since you've all been there, we just had our award ceremony the other day, and believe it or not, we actually ended 20 minutes early, okay? I mean, unbelievable. See, AID can just keep getting better, right? Well, I thank you very much, Alex, for the introduction. I want to particularly thank yourself, Carol, Tish, and other colleagues who joined you to come over and call on Gail Smith about 2 weeks ago. She really enjoyed that discussion. She was fully engaged, and I think you may have sent a note around to people already about it. We've been trying to line this up for some time, and it's been difficult. She's very much looking forward to coming over here this afternoon. As you may know, she hurt her leg. She isn't still quite sure exactly how, but so you'll see her kind of a little bit physically challenged with some crutches when she comes up here, but it hasn't diminished either her spirit or her energy level, and she has to actually contain herself not to re-hurt herself. So I'm really delighted that she'll be coming this afternoon. I also wanted to just add to, Carol, your comments about the cooperative agreement grant that we just provided literally on the 29th of September to the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training. I see Jim Michael chuckling over here because he knows what that means. If it was midnight on the 30th or whenever when we signed that thing. We're really excited about that, and the oral histories are really going to be important. We know you've already done that, quite a few before with Haven North, but this one I think will add even more prominence because, among other things, we will be doing together oral histories of retired FSNs as well. So, and that was something that they wanted, that we wanted, and actually Gail just came back from East Africa and was so impressed with our FSNs in East Africa, not only the Kenyan, but the South Sudanese ones who've gone through hell, that she announced at the award ceremony a couple days ago this particular award. It was because she so wants to capture our FSN's contributions. The only other thing I wanted to point out over here, we speak about history, but it also starts when we're all younger. So Scott, can you stand up for a second? This is Scott Hokenberg, who's the president of the Young Professionals at AID. And he's got quite a few people coming here today and this afternoon. So Scott, he also works for me, so I guess he had to be here. But no, he's just been great. So I think I'd like to just give a brief intro of a few words for each of our colleagues here, and then we'll get right into it. So you all know John Sanbrailo. John is the executive director of the Pan American Development Foundation. You've been there for almost 18 years, 17 years or something like that. He joined AID when he was in elementary school, and he served as mission director in Ecuador, Peru, Honduras, and El Salvador. Consultant to Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, various countries in the region, and is preparing his book on the history of the United States assistance in Latin America, and did publish in the Foreign Service Journal. And I was part of that vote to get your article in there because I'm the only AID guy on the Foreign Service Journal editorial board. So thanks for your continued perseverance
and it wouldn't
in all
have
that.
happened without you.
Well, we just had to have a little arm wrestling, that's all. So Julia, welcome. You are Associate Professor of History at the University of South Florida. I'm sure you will speak briefly here this morning about your book, Making the World Safe, The American Red Cross and a Nation's Humanitarian Awakening, published by Oxford University Press. And Curt, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Specialist in Foreign Affairs in the Foreign Affairs Defense and Trade Division of the Congressional Research Service of the Library of Congress. He has served with U.S. senators in Congress. He has served with the UN Development Program in Southern Africa, and he's got a PhD from the London School of Economics, so don't mess with him. So I think without further ado, we'll get started here. I will just say that the timing of this could not be better. As a matter of fact, I heard about your history project, and I would be delighted if it was ready by next Wednesday, because yesterday I got an assignment from our transition support team to have a history of USAID ready for the new incoming team by next Wednesday close of business. So I think the timing of this is perfect. So without further ado, let's get started.
Okay.
And we'll take questions and answers when our speakers are done.
Well, let me thank UAA. All right, this is. Let's see. Are we? Okay.
Thanks, Julie.
Well, let me thank UAA again for inviting me, and for those who have indulged me and heard me in other presentations. I hope I have some additional new things to say about the earliest history of foreign assistance. I am titling my work Extending the American Revolution Overseas, and I see foreign assistance in that context, as some of you have heard in the past. And several years ago, this wouldn't even be a subject on the agenda, because during most of our careers, foreign assistance essentially began as a post-World War II phenomena with the Marshall Plan and Point 4. It's only recently among historians like Julia and her excellent and fabulous book, which I highly recommend, have discovered or rediscovered, really, that there is a much richer and deeper and longer history. And I see that history as extending back to the very beginnings, to the founding of the country. Now you can ask, well, does it really make any difference? Why is this so important at all? If it began with the Marshall Plan or it began with the Founding Fathers, does it really matter? And I would argue that if we don't know where we've come from, we don't know the intellectual origins of a program that is driven largely by ideas, we don't know where we're going. And this is particularly critical in the coming years with the movement that will take place and coming up with new foreign assistance legislation. So I'm going to run through this quickly. I'm going to spend most of the time on the 19th century and quickly run through a series of cases. But I just wanted to remind people that there are different views about history and the importance of history. I think we would probably all agree that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, and that history is pretty important. But one then has to ask why these lofty words of our ex-administrator weren't translated perhaps into specific actions within USAID along these same lines. And I often point out the famous words of Henry Ford: history is bunk. The only history that's worth a damn is the history that we make today. And I would argue that too often this has probably been the dominant theme within the foreign assistance community. I've already mentioned about foreign aid origins, that there are two competing schools. the school that has been led certainly by the guru of international relations, Hans Morgenthau, in the 40s and 50s and 60s that we all read when we were in the universities, who essentially saw foreign aid as a post-World War II innovation. More recently, historians, very prominent historians like Gordon Wood, Pulitzer Prize winner, see it more broadly and see it more deeply rooted in American history. And they go back to the Founding Fathers. He and others go back to the Founding Fathers, who were development philosophers. They were concerned about how societies move to greater liberty and greater progress, what they termed the pursuit of happiness. I have divided the foreign aid history into a series of chapters. I presented this previously in other presentations here. I won't try to go through that now, other than to say that there is, again, before World War II, a very rich history, a very important history loaded with lessons that are so contemporary that I want to address. The founders speak to us through the ages, and even today, and I address your attention to Barack Obama's inaugural address in 2013. And these words echoed what Thomas Jefferson said when he was advising Lafayette on the drafting of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in 1789, that this ball of liberty will bounce around the world. And there's a direct line between what Jefferson did with the French Revolution and what USAID has done in recent years with the Arab Spring and democratic transitions. And I address your to these lofty words, this very expansive definition of the U.S. role overseas in promoting democracy, which is directly from Jefferson. I also have come up with the symbol, again, Jefferson probably being the first, if you want to call him, USAID officer. Here is the Peace and Friendship Medal that Jefferson designed early on, minted in silver. That was a form of aid used with the sovereign tribes in the West. I am convinced that the graphic designer who came up with the aid hand clasp drew upon this. I haven't yet been able to prove it, but the hand clasp goes back to 1953, the Mutual Security Agency, and I hope eventually to be able to document that. Foreign aid pioneers. I've come up with, and my research identified a whole host of them. And the people that you see here are only the tip of the iceberg. And there are literally hundreds of them in the 19th century, emerging from Jefferson and Hamilton and Franklin, inspired by the principles of the Declaration of Independence, the founding of the country, and the desire to extend those principles overseas as well as domestically. Just to run you through quickly some of the foreign aid examples. I mentioned 1789, Jefferson's minister in Paris. He's helping Lafayette draft the Declaration of Rights of Man. I challenge anyone to read that and say that's not democracy officers at work today around the world. 1794, U.S. Congressional appropriated funds. It's often said there were no congressional appropriated funds before the 20th century for foreign aid. 1794, Hamilton leads the effort to aid Haitian refugees. John Adams undertakes a major effort to send economic and military assistance to the Haitian revolutionaries to express support for American ideals, but also to undermine French interests. That lays the basis for the Louisiana Purchase. The support the U.S. gave to Chilean independence and the development of the new government in Chile, almost directly out of governance, modernization that we see today. Appropriated funds, again, in 1812, and I wish I had more time to go into, maybe in the Q&A, there are tremendous lessons of Alexander Scott, who delivered the earthquake assistance, food aid to earthquake victims in Venezuela, and how he had to grapple with the conflicting objectives that the Congress laid out in the legislation that put up the $50,000 for food aid to Venezuela. Very contemporary. It shows how things don't really change. The establishment of Liberia, nation building. The Greek independence movement. The U.S. in the 1820s was dominated by Greek fever. Harvard University was the center of a major response to sending aid, foreign aid. Private aid, yes, but it was very closely coordinated with the government, where the government laid out the policy. And I want to come back to that issue because I think that's where historians have gotten some things mixed up in terms of saying that foreign aid in the 19th century was largely private. 1830s, increasing technical assistance requests to the U.S. government. That's well documented in several books, and much of this is all well documented. This is not something that certainly I'm inventing here. The response to the Irish famine in the late 1840s, that was again largely a private response, but the U.S. government, particularly George M. Dallas, who you saw in those photos, vice president, rode all over the country doing fundraising for this. The development plan of Liberia. During the Civil War, there was expansion of aid, particularly Seward and Sumner, aiding English textile workers who were thrown out of work by the cotton famine, and a whole host of other that culminating at the end of the century with multilateral assistance, what becomes the Pan American Union, today the OAS, the establishment of the ARC, the American Red Cross that Julia will talk about, as a foreign aid agency, and a whole host of humanitarian assistance. Foreign aid in the 19th century was so pervasive that it even generated its rejectionist literature. And none other than Mark Twain led this rejectionist literature, and his famous novel, The Connecticut Yankee. And I have recommended that every new aid officer entering USAID should really be required to read Twain and Twain's critique. Much of the criticism of foreign aid today is warmed over Mark Twain arguments. In any case, what do we see in the 19th century? We see a whole host of initiatives, all of which we see technical assistance, we see food aid, we see humanitarian assistance, we see nation building, we see policy dialogue, we see technology transfer, we see institution building, we see private sector involvement, we see infrastructure development. In other words, we see all the elements. We see NGOs that are established in the 1810s. We see missionary movement that are the equivalent of the Peace Corps. We see almost every element that today in the 21st century and what we've all experienced. So the conclusions. Foreign aid is deeply rooted in American history. As I argue, it's part of the DNA of American society. It's not an aberration. It's not one of these illegitimate programs as so often seen. It's inspired by the principles of the American Revolution. It's essentially an extension of the American Revolution, much like historians talk about domestic history of the abolition of slavery, women's rights, this increasing extension of the rights under the Constitution to excluded groups domestically. Foreign aid is essentially an instrument for carrying that out. It's a mixture of idealistic and realistic impulses in foreign policy. There are tremendous lessons in each one of those cases I went through. 240 years of spreading democracy and development around the world. And certainly 55 years of USAID is one important critical chapter, certainly in all of this. And to know what we have done is to know who we are. We wouldn't be Americans if we weren't trying to improve and democratize the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. Julia, if you'd be kind enough to just stay here, it's easier for the tech booth to record the speaking because the vibration from the, it's okay. They got it, they still got yours, but I think this will be better. Thank you. Please, go ahead. John, thank you. Okay, John, thank you very much. And I love the quote at the end, to know what we've done is to know who we are. So I may use your quote if you don't mind in our write-up next week.
While we're waiting for my PowerPoint to come up, is my mic on?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so, yeah.
I just wanted to thank you all for the invitation, and I'm really delighted to be part of this panel and to join John and Curt in talking about the history of foreign aid, and to speak with all of you about it too. So, here we go. All right, so I will be speaking, as title suggests, about U.S. humanitarian aid from the 1890s to the Second World War. And with John's opening remarks, he's really established the central point that I wanted to make today. U.S. foreign assistance doesn't originate with the Marshall Plan, doesn't originate with Point 4 in the post-World War II period. It actually has a much longer history, dating back to the early republic, as John spoke about. But as Americans moved into the late 1890s and really the first 45 years of the 20th century, we see U.S. foreign assistance only beginning to grow, more routine and more commonplace. Much of this aid was carried out by private citizens and voluntary associations, but the U.S. government itself is actually becoming a much more active participant in U.S. foreign aid projects during the early 20th century, really setting clear precedents for the Marshall Plan and all that would follow. As John sort of alluded to in his remarks, crucial to this history and to the expansion of U.S. foreign aid more generally was the formation and subsequent rise of the American Red Cross. Founded in 1881 by Clara Barton, the American Red Cross quickly garnered a national reputation for its domestic disaster relief work. During the 1890s, though, it first began to provide humanitarian assistance to other nations as well. Its missions during the 1890s included providing food to famine sufferers in Russia in 1891 and 92, to Christians in Armenia facing persecution by the Ottoman Empire, and providing food and other relief to Cuban civilians during Cuba's revolution against Spain. In 1900, in recognition of its accomplishments both at home and abroad, Congress would grant the American Red Cross a federal charter. And with this charter, the Red Cross essentially became what was called the Official Voluntary Aid Association of the United States. And I love this official voluntary. It is the recognized voluntary aid association of the U.S. The federal government doesn't have its own foreign aid association agency yet. USAID's formation is obviously 60 years in the future. But from this point forward, the American Red Cross essentially serves as the humanitarian arm of the U.S. government. U.S. officials would rely on the American Red Cross to raise funds and provide assistance for foreign wars and disasters, and worked very closely with it. Its original headquarters, in fact, were in the offices. Its offices were in the Department of State, War, and the Navy before it got its headquarters where it currently is and during World War I. So just kind of testifies the closeness of this relationship. We look at the years from 1900 to 1914, the outbreak of World War I. We see the American Red Cross providing humanitarian relief to many countries throughout the world. American Red Cross aid reached survivors of earthquakes, floods, and other natural disasters as far afield as Chile, Jamaica, Italy, Serbia, Portugal, Costa Rica, Japan, and China in these 14 years alone. Crucially, though, even as the American Red Cross was doing all this work, the U.S. government doesn't delegate everything to this organization. In the first 15 years of the 20th century, the federal government itself also regularly committed resources to foreign assistance. In 1902, for instance, Congress would appropriate $200,000 in relief to aid victims of a volcanic eruption in Martinique. In 1909, it gave $800,000 for survivors of a tsunami and earthquake in southern Italy. And that's a pretty extraordinary sum at the time, $800,000. The U.S. Armed Forces also took part in humanitarian missions. During that same disaster in southern Italy, President Roosevelt ordered 4 ships of the Great White Fleet to proceed to Italy and provide assistance. The U.S. Army donated tents and blankets to survivors of an earthquake in Costa Rica. The Naval Department sent one of its ships on a relief mission to a 1912 earthquake in the Ottoman Empire. These are just a few examples. In many places as well, ambassadors and consular officials were the ones taking charge of relief operations when disasters occurred on the ground. Often they were working in coordination with missionaries who happened to be in the area, other American citizens as well. This is a period in which the United States is really expanding on the world stage, both sort of officially and commercially. And so there are a lot of Americans throughout the world who are taking part in these aid efforts. These are just a few examples. The larger point, though, is that the U.S., both the U.S. government and the American Red Cross, as well as many American private citizens, were providing foreign aid on an increasingly routine basis in the early 20th century. If the early 20th century, though, saw a rise in U.S. foreign aid, the First World War and its aftermath were really a watershed moment for the history of U.S. foreign aid and humanitarian assistance. World War I began in the summer of 1914, and for nearly 3 years, the United States remained officially neutral. From the start of the conflict, though, the United States intervened in the Great War in a very different way, through the provision of money, material supplies, and medical care to European soldiers and non-combatants. Thousands upon thousands of American men and women gave money to aid organizations or volunteered their time collecting food, knitting socks and bandages, and raising money for the war effort. They donated to the American Red Cross as well as to other organizations, such as the Commission for Relief in Belgium and the American Committee for Armenian and Syrian Relief. Scores of American men and women also traveled to Europe, where they administered relief to soldiers and civilians through groups like the American Ambulance Association. Once the United States entered the conflict in April 1917, the nation's humanitarian intervention in Europe swelled to really enormous proportions. In 1917 and 18, dozens of non-governmental agencies, the YMCA, the American Friends Service Committee, the Knights of Columbus, the Salvation Army, among others, raised funds, mobilized volunteers, and organized aid operations abroad. But in these years, the American Red Cross truly dominated the humanitarian field. It served as the nation's unrivaled leader in both civilian and military relief. By the time the armistice was signed in November 1918, 22 million adults and 11 million children, that's 1/3 of the US population at the time, had become members of the American Red Cross by donating at least $1 to the organization. So just sort of think about the statistics there. This support allowed the American Red Cross to amass a war fund of over $400 million in 2 years alone. And again, this is an extraordinary sum at the time. $400 million is a drop in the bucket today, but in 1918, it was a lot. These finances would enable the Red Cross and its personnel to orchestrate a mammoth humanitarian program in both Europe and the Near East. From April 1917 to November 1918, American doctors, nurses, and other aid workers traversed the continent working in 24 different countries. In these examples, France and Italy, each dot on the screen represents just one American Red Cross project. And again, this is just 2 countries of the 24 in which it was involved. And in these sites, American relief workers constructed a really wide-ranging and comprehensive humanitarian program for Allied soldiers and non-combatants. They provided aid to ill and wounded soldiers at the front, and they established and staffed thousands of feeding stations, hospitals, clinics, and rest houses like these. They distributed clothing and assisted refugees and orphans in finding new homes. And they oversaw a vast array of hygienic and sanitary initiatives, things like anti-typhus and anti-tuberculosis campaigns, for example, going beyond sort of mere relief. By the time hostilities ceased in November 1918, these efforts had really morphed into a humanitarian undertaking of enormous proportions, of a scope and scale that was, up to that point, entirely unprecedented. While much of this assistance flowed through the American Red Cross and other private channels, it's important to point out that the US government was actively involved in facilitating these efforts. President Woodrow Wilson actively publicized the American Red Cross's work, serving as a spokesman for that organization. Secretaries of State William Jennings Bryan and later Robert Lansing both engaged in negotiations with belligerent nations to allow for the safe passage of American assistance. Throughout the European continent, U.S. Foreign Service officials were working closely with humanitarian agencies to distribute relief supplies. They're reliant on the private sector, in other words. The U.S. government was nothing if not an active promoter and collaborator with these private initiatives. With the signing of the armistice in November 1918, the U.S. humanitarian intervention in Europe again undergoes a profound transformation. At the end of the war, Europe faced a profound humanitarian crisis. More than 4 years of conflict had left millions hungry, homeless, sick, widowed, and orphaned. In response to this suffering, the U.S. government officials increased the state's involvement in foreign assistance tremendously. Taking an unprecedented role in foreign aid, the U.S. government organized a comprehensive program to feed hungry Europe. In late February 1919, Woodrow Wilson issued an executive order creating the American Relief Administration, an organization charged with acquiring, transporting, and distributing foodstuffs to European civilians. Congress, in turn, would give $100 million appropriation to fund the ARA's operation through June 30th, 1919. Over the next several months, ARA personnel purchased and distributed hundreds of millions of dollars worth of food and other aid in Europe, reaching millions of civilians in more than 20 nations. Once the ARA's federal mandate expired, it was actually reorganized as a non-governmental relief organization. And in this new permutation, it remained a central player in foreign assistance for several more years. Its personnel continued to distribute food in Europe until 1922, and in Soviet Russia until 1923. World War I and its aftermath had in many ways been really a watershed moment in the history of U.S. foreign aid. As we move into the interwar years, from the 1920s to the mid-1930s, U.S. foreign assistance would in many ways return to the patterns of the pre-war era. The American Red Cross would remain a principal provider of U.S. foreign aid during wars and disasters overseas, while many other private citizens and voluntary associations carried out their own fundraising and relief efforts. The U.S. State Department, Naval and War Departments, Congress, and the White House would continue to supplement and complement these efforts in many ways. During the 20s, the event that probably, arguably, triggered the most considerable U.S. humanitarian response was the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake in Japan, really one of the most devastating disasters the world had ever witnessed. In response to that catastrophe, the U.S. ultimately contributed over $20 million worth of cash, supplies, and other assistance, an extraordinary sum at the time, and nearly 2/3 the amount of all other nations combined. So pretty large expenditure. The American Red Cross would raise and contribute over $11 million alone, but the U.S. War and Naval Departments also contributed $8 million worth of supplies and services, something that was later reimbursed by Congress. This was a sizable intervention, but it was not the only one in these years. The U.S. also made major relief contributions following floods in China in 1924 and 31, a hurricane in Cuba in 1926, and the Dominican Republic in 1930, and an earthquake in Nicaragua in 1931. Smaller amounts of American aid reached the victims of natural disasters in dozens of other countries as well. While much of the U.S. foreign aid of the interwar years was for the relief of natural disasters, towards the end of the 30s, the escalation of hostilities in several countries would again stimulate U.S. wartime assistance. With the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War in 1936, for instance, roughly 2,800 Americans volunteered to travel to Spain to join the international brigades to help fight fascism, the so-called Abraham Lincoln Brigades. In addition to joining the fight, though, many of these individuals were involved in providing medical relief and other forms of humanitarian aid to Spanish loyalists and their allies. In the U.S., groups like the American Committee for Spanish Relief raised thousands and thousands of dollars to fund these efforts. With the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War the following year, in 1937, Many Americans similarly worked to provide material and medical relief to civilians, especially in China. During the Second World War, the U.S. would again become a major provider of foreign aid in ways that resembled, yet far surpassed, the First World War. American voluntary agencies alone received over $504 million for overseas relief during the war, aid which reached soldiers and civilians alike. The U.S. government, meanwhile, became far more involved, officially speaking, in the sphere of foreign aid. In late 1902, the establishment of the Office of Foreign Relief and Rehabilitation Operations in many ways marked the U.S. government's official entrance into the field of wartime humanitarian assistance. By the fall of 1943, the U.S. government's commitments ballooned further still with the establishment of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRWA. UNRWA was an international relief agency, but the U.S. played a major and dominant role in it due to its great wealth. Congress would appropriate $1.35 billion to UNRWA in March 1944, and ultimately the U.S. government supplied over $2.6 billion, or 70% of UNRWA's total budget and expenditures. During World War II, U.S. foreign aid, both voluntary and increasingly governmental, thus reached millions of men, women, and children, the victims of the crisis of war. Once the war ended, the United States would really never go back. Foreign aid by this point had become firmly established as a major and official part of U.S. foreign relations. While still carried out largely by private citizens and non-governmental organizations, the U.S. government itself had also become a central provider of U.S. international assistance. With the launch of the European Recovery Program, or Marshall Plan, in 1947, this trend would only become more solidified, something that I believe Curt will now address. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Julie. Fascinating. Curt, why don't you just stay there? That would probably be best for the recording.
So you can see me.
And that's a perfect transition. Thank you, Julia.
Good morning, everyone. Oh.
I think they'll get the mic back there.
Do they turn it on or do I?
There may be a mute button.
There we go.
Can you hear me now?
I don't think you need to do anything. It should be done in the booth. As long as it's plugged in, it's on.
Just speak and see what happens.
Hello?
There we go.
I can tell that. Oops. All right. Good morning.
Good morning.
I see a lot of familiar faces here, Betty. And I just want to take the opportunity before I launch into my little speech here to thank all of you over the years who have helped me do my job, which is to help Congress. I've talked to a lot of you sometimes in the missions, and USAID has always been extremely helpful. I see some other familiar faces, but anyway. Just thought you should know that you've done a great service for Congress by assisting those of us at CRS to answer the members' questions. So I hope you enjoyed my, or learned as much as I did from my colleagues' talks. Excuse me. Those programs they're talking about are a lot less well known than the one I'm going to be talking about. At least most people think they know something about the Marshall Plan. But in case you need a refresher, I'm going to give you the 10-second version. As you know, in 1947, Europe was still recovering from the war, and its economic system reflected the autarky of the pre-war period. Trade was stagnant. Capital was increasingly unavailable for investment. Europeans didn't grow enough food to feed themselves. They all suffered huge dollar deficits and were unable to purchase goods from the United States, which at this point was the only viable supplier of many industrial and agricultural goods. And as a result, communist parties threatened to gain power in a number of Western European countries. And along came Secretary of State George Marshall, who in June of 1947 offered U.S. assistance. And after a lengthy period of discussion and negotiation with the Europeans and with Congress, Congress gave its approval in 1948, and an aid program was launched, the centerpiece of which was about $13 billion in assistance. That's about $145 billion in today's dollars. And this was to 16 countries over a roughly 3-year period. During the program, Europe's economy grew, the communist threat receded. End of story, right? But not quite. Because ever since, policymakers, they never forgot the Marshall Plan, and over the decades, prominent figures from Henry Kissinger to Al Gore to Bono more recently have proposed a Marshall Plan for various places and purposes. And I'm a Washington nerd, so of course I've collected these various pronouncements for a Marshall Plan. And just to give you an idea, and this is in the last 30 years alone, there have been calls for Marshall Plans for Central America, the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, impoverished areas of the United States, the Middle East, the Philippines, the environment, that's Al Gore, of course, the Caribbean, Midwest flood victims for Africa, Bono, for AIDS, for a digital Marshall Plan, for Afghanistan, for Iraq, Ukraine, Greece, Washington, D.C. schools, Mexico, and Central America, among others. So, you know, I doubt whether any of these people who proposed a Marshall Plan were actually proposing that the actual Marshall Plan should be adopted for use. And I doubt whether they had any specific aspect of the plan that they wished to apply to a modern program. It seems pretty clear to me that what they're really saying is, we want a huge program that's really successful. In fact, the only people who really seem to have learned any real lessons from the Marshall Plan and tried to apply those lessons have been the policymakers that devised the Marshall Plan's successor institutions, including those at USAID. The Marshall Plan itself drew on earlier aid relief efforts, as you've heard, but in this case, they applied them to development problems while establishing some of its own precedents. The first precedent was the administrating agency itself. The Economic Cooperation Administration, the ECA, was the great-grandfather, maybe even great-great-grandfather of USAID, because there were a number of institutions in between. One operational lesson of the ECA that was later applied to USAID was adoption of a mission system in each of the participating countries, with all the positive features that this brings in terms of a close relationship and interaction with governments and the private sector. It allowed the ECA's economists to dig deep into the causes and the solutions of each country's problems in a period when government and business information was not widely available. But I can't resist pointing out to this particular audience one way in which the ECA wasn't entirely an operational model for USAID. Like USAID, the ECA was established as an independent agency. However, the legislative language creating the ECA put it and the State Department on an equal footing. The ECA was given the status, and I quote the legislation, comparable to the head of an executive department. The legislative language required that the administrator of the ECA and the Secretary of State must keep each other informed of each other's actions and policies, and required that in the case of any differences between the two, the President would adjudicate. The State Department was responsible for negotiating the basic agreements with the participating countries. So at that level, it was in charge of setting policy. But after that, the ECA was equal to state. This was a congressional provision. The administration version would have given the State Department complete control. But Congress did not trust the State Department. And more informally, Congress let it be known that it wanted the ECA administrator to be a Republican. Remember, it was a Democratic administration at the time. They wanted it to be a Republican and from the private sector. and both of which requests it got in the form of Paul Hoffman, who was a Studebaker executive. Although it may have been a congressional intent, there is no sign that the ECA was ever treated as a cabinet position by the Truman administration. But the idea of a development agency as a member of the cabinet equal to state has lingered on over the decades and has been considered as an option by aid reform commissions ever since. But in this particular case, where it actually happened, it worked very well. In its actual programs, the Marshall Plan introduced a number of methods of assistance later adopted by USAID. First, the plan favored grants over loans. In this, it was a forerunner of future development programs, but a definite departure from Lend-Lease and some of the other previous post-war aid. Post-war aid up to that time had been about 2/3 repayable loans and 1/3 relief supplies, which the relief supplies were grants. Although it had been expected that loans would make up about 20 to 40% of Marshall Plan aid, it didn't work out this way. This is largely because the criteria for determining the form of assistance, and that was left up to the ECA, was the capacity of countries to repay without jeopardizing their economies. And so they decided that grants would be best, and in the end, 95% of assistance was in the form of grants. But it wasn't until, as you may know, 25 years later, with the New Directions policy, that grants again became the predominant form of U.S. development assistance. A second innovation that the plan promoted was policy reform. In the period following the war, the United States had already provided $11 billion in ad hoc relief aid, as I just mentioned. That's almost as much as the entire Marshall Plan itself. But no dent had been made in recovery using this aid. The Marshall Plan was meant to be different. It was described by policymakers at the time as a recovery, not a relief program. It was a development program. It was also, as his name indicated, a plan, a concerted program with a definite purpose. Had there been a country development cooperation strategy at the time, it would have had only one goal: economic growth. And among the development objectives under that goal would have been an increase in each country's production and the economic integration of Europe, both of which required policy reforms at the national level. To achieve them, US and European officials worked together to identify obstacles to growth, to avoid unsound national investment plans, and to promote adoption of appropriate currency levels, among other aims. Much like the economic reform programs that the US has supported in recent decades, the US gave governments some economic space. The assistance gave them economic space, helping their publics to avoid hardships that then allowed the governments to make these reforms at less political cost. To leverage policy reform, the plan adopted two aid methods that were used in earlier post-war programs, but were expanded on and were applied then to development efforts. Both commodity import programs and counterpart funds later became tools in the arsenal of US aid. The lion's share of US appropriated funds, about 85%, were delivered as a commodity import program. I mean, they didn't call it that, but it's basically what it was, which the participating countries could use to purchase US goods, both agricultural and industrial. Even more important to meeting the Marshall Plan aims was the counterpart funds. Each country was required to match the US grant contribution, $1 of their currency for $1 of ours, which was put into a counterpart fund for each country. And this brought considerable policy leverage because whatever the uses, it could be used for infrastructure programs, but before it could be used, each project, infrastructure project, had to be approved by the ECA administrator. The Marshall Plan may also be said to have launched the first participant training program. In its effort to increase European production, the plan made an effort to improve European business practices, in particular addressing industrial and agricultural productivity, marketing, manpower utilization, transportation, and tourism. Small amounts of the counterpart funds were then employed to bring European management, technicians, and labor over to the United States for training in what became known as productivity tours. Over 6,000 Europeans came to the United States for these tours. But perhaps the most important lesson of the Marshall Plan comes in the value placed by US policymakers on country ownership. And of course, that resonates with the current USAID. But there really shouldn't be any surprise that the US decision makers realized that there was an importance in treating Europeans as equal. I mean, frankly, any hint of paternalism with Europeans just simply wouldn't have worked. That doesn't mean that the ECA let them alone to do what they wanted. It did guide them, but with an extremely light touch. Country ownership actually began with Secretary Marshall's famous speech. He suggested a program of assistance, but then he left it open as to what kind of assistance. He really was inviting the Europeans to come up with a suggestion. And that's what the Europeans did. In July of 1947, a month after the speech, the Europeans met, all 16 nations met in a conference in Paris, and they established what was called the Committee of European Economic Cooperation. And its purpose was to gather information from all the countries on what the European requirements would be and come up with a proposal. Its report called for a 4-year program to encourage production, create internal financial stability, develop economic cooperation among participating countries, and solve the deficit problem then existing with the American dollar zone. The report requested $19 billion in US assistance, and Congress did approve about $17 billion, but in the end, what was appropriated was $13 billion. Now, mind you, even at this early stage, the US policymakers had some input into what the Europeans ended up suggesting. They didn't want the proposal just to be a laundry list of needs. You know, they wanted a coherent program to generate long-term growth. So they made it a condition of its acceptance of the proposal on 6 factors, including the making of specific commitments to fulfill production programs and greater determination on the part of Europeans to lower trade barriers. In the end, of course, the Europeans accepted all 6 conditions and put them into their report. Now, in implementing the plan, US representatives in Europe were very sensitive to the political concerns of their European colleagues. And only in very, very few occasions did they exercise any kind of threat of sanctions. Actually, never really actually exercised it. They just made threats, but very few times, to Italy and France on a couple of occasions, if they weren't seeming to comply with their bilateral agreements. Now, as I mentioned, one of those objectives of the Marshall Plan was European integration. The key to that Europeanization was the OEEC, which came out of the Committee on European Economic Cooperation. This was the organization of European Economic Cooperation. The Europeans established the OEEC in order to maintain this idea of a joint nature of the program. It wasn't just bilateral, it was a joint nature, and to reinforce the sense of mutual responsibility for the success of the program. The participating countries jointly pledged to the obligations, and the OEC was an instrument to help make these obligations, to fulfill the obligations. The most controversial decision of the Marshall Plan was the decision of how to divide all this aid among the 16 countries. And the United States decided, again, with country ownership in mind, to step back and say, you guys do it. And so they handed this decision over to the OEEC, and the countries themselves had to figure out, well, what are the principles in which we figure out which countries get what money. And as you can imagine, it's led to a lot of bickering, a long process of working this out, negotiation, to put it politely. But in the end, they came up with a formula that worked for these few years of the Marshall Plan. So the principle of country ownership spared the United States from the blame that would have been involved if they had to make that decision, and the lobbying that would have occurred as a result if they had to make the allocation decision. And many historians believe that it was in fact this process of letting the Europeans decide amongst themselves how to do this that helped to mold the very cooperation that ultimately facilitated agreements on lowering trade barriers during the course of the Marshall Plan, and then later the establishment of the coal and steel community in 1952, and then leading up to the European community later. So country ownership was clearly a very vital element of the Marshall Plan. I'm going to raise one more item before stopping. I don't know what my time is. Okay, one aspect of the Marshall Plan that might resonate with some of you is the question of judging its success. On the surface, economic indicators suggested that the plan was a resounding success. For instance, by 1951, industrial production for all participating countries was 41% above the pre-war 1938 level. That's exceeding the goal of the program, which was just 30%. But some have argued that the connection between Marshall Plan assistance and European growth cannot be made. In the 1980s, a very respected British economist rolled out a detailed analysis making the point that the Marshall Plan represented too little assistance as a percentage of whole economies to make a difference. It was never more than 5% of GNP in any country. So as you know, similar arguments have been made with the current aid program, with in fact all economic aid programs since. Now, I would argue that a very narrow economic analysis such as this ignores the broader picture that would include the political effect of US support and the confidence building of a depressed Europe that this support meant, and the strategic funding that occurred of certain industries, and the moves toward economic integration, however small, that occurred during this time, and especially the range of policy reforms undertaken by individual nations. These influenced the overall economic situation in ways that could not be measured. And beyond the economic impact, everyone would agree, most historians would agree, that the political impact of the Marshall Plan was significant, both in the short and the long term. The decline of Communist Party power in Europe, the budding political and economic unification of the region, and most of all, the strength and status of US-European cooperation that lasts into this day. So finally, I would like to suggest one more way that the Marshall Plan Marshall Plan outcomes rarely ever mentioned actually in historic studies, and that is that the actual perceived success of the Marshall Plan helped fuel the political support for foreign aid in other development programs that followed after that in far more challenging environments than Europe in the years that followed, and that ultimately led directly to the establishment of USAID. So,
thank you, Curt. So this has been a fantastic panorama that takes us back to the beginnings of our country and right up, frankly, to our own lives. And so I want to thank all of you just from the get-go here. But I'll just start with a comment, a question rather, and then see what your reaction, and we'll open it up to everybody. Our current mission statement in USAID, and many of you are involved in this, basically says, we partner to end extreme poverty and promote resilient democracy while advancing our security and prosperity. That is the current mission statement for our agency. It was put together largely by 2,500 of our workforce. It has so far stood the test of the past few years. A number of us are pushing hard to make sure it stands the test of the next few years. And I go back to Marshall's statement, which I found, I think one of you may have seen it, when he introduced the Marshall Plan, he said, the purpose of this plan is really to revive the working economy in the world so as to permit the emergence of political and social fabric in which free institutions can exist. So I asked this question to focus in on what's in the U.S. interest? What's in the American people's interest? Why do we do this? Why has this continued to have some support over the last 2 centuries and right up through post-World War II? So we'll start with that, and we'll throw it open then out here. Ladies first, maybe.
Well, I mean, I think my argument is that there are multiple reasons, and I think we can't discount and say there's only one reason out there. So what I like to point to start out is that there are, I think, authentic and genuine humanitarian motivations to reduce suffering, among the public and government officials alike, seeing suffering in the world and a desire to reduce that suffering and to use the United States resources, its material resources, its intellectual, monetary resources to make the world a better place. But at the same time, I think we can't deny that there are also strategic and economic motivations. Strategic, coming back to the idea of containing Bolshevism early in the 20th century, it's often anarchy as well. The sort of sense that if we don't step in after a disaster happens when war is happening, it's only going to spiral and get worse. And so humanitarian assistance is a way to help that. Economically, the United States has major trading partners throughout the world. When, say, an earthquake happens in Guatemala in 1917, it affects the U.S. coffee industry there tremendously. So, thinking that's just one sort of example. Helping provide assistance gets normal trade flowing. It gets workers back to work, so it serves U.S. economic interests as well. So I think this sort of constellation, strategic, economic, and genuine humanitarian concern helps to explain it.
Okay, thanks, Julie.
Yes, I would identify with, certainly with Julia's words. It's never one reason. There are multi-purposes that drive the program. But at the same time, there are common themes that emerge from the very beginnings of the country. I think the USAID mission statement, I think Jefferson and the founding fathers would come back and say, right on, guys, you did the right thing. This was our vision. This was what Lincoln said, the last best hope of man. That is, I think, part of what's there. That doesn't deny that there are critical strategic issues. I think a number of historians have pointed this out in the 19th century, like Robert Kagan. We weren't really an isolationist power, focused only on continental expansion. We were heavily involved overseas, and what we would call today foreign assistance, they didn't call it that at the time, was a critical piece of that as I ran through in those cases. And I think the early pioneers would look upon that USAID mission statement and identify with it.
That's very reassuring to hear that, because there is still a little controversy back at headquarters among staff on that one, but generally it has held the test. Curt?
Well, I would certainly agree with my colleagues. On the strategic side, the fact is that while there was an incredibly lengthy period of discussion about passing the Marshall Plan and a million reasons why Americans in general didn't favor the concept originally, there was a strong anti-foreign aid feeling in the country, not too different than what you've heard since then. In fact, the phrase money down a rat hole was possibly coined at the time because it was repeated constantly in 1947, and maybe where Jesse Helms picked that phrase up. But in any case, it did pass, and one of the reasons it passed is this fear of communism, which was not necessarily the strongest element at the beginning, but 3 weeks, I think it was, before the passage of the Marshall Plan, Jan Masaryk in Czechoslovakia was murdered, and that seemed to have really kind of turned the scales on that case, and it passed very easily. At least, historians do say that, the fear of communism was possibly the final step that led to passage.
Well, thank you. I think we should open this up for questions, discussion, and we have a mic. If people would just kindly remind folks of just their name again. Most of you know each other, but not everybody. Scott, we've got right here up the front. Oh, okay, you can go first, sure.
These were. Hello? Now talk. Well, these were great presentations. Thank you so much, everyone, which is wonderful.
Name.
Yeah. I just wanted to throw in a couple of little tidbits. And Julie, you referred to this. You showed Herbert Hoover as head of the, forgotten, the American Relief
Administration.
But as I understand, before the war, he was sort of at the head, and many of us probably know this, of basically saving Belgium from starvation. By organizing all of this stuff. He was in Britain at the time, an engineer. I learned this as I was serving in Belgium. The Belgians consider Herbert Hoover a hero, and many things are named for him in Belgium. We, of course, have a different point of view about Hoover. But the other thing is, and I think many of us know this, he was known as a great humanitarian, and I think that led to his political career.
Yeah.
Identify yourself, Bill. I think it'd be helpful if people identify.
Bill Anderson.
Thank you, Bill. Somebody over on this side. Okay, John.
Yes, thank you for 3 fabulous presentations, and I think these are all going to be available on the website, if we don't remember everything that you've said. On the Marshall Plan, I happened to read a book about it. It was really fascinating, and you've covered, I think, the main points. But tell us a little bit more about, you said the U.S. policy hand was quite careful. But as I understand it, the first year, all 16 countries had to prepare. The idea was they had to have a program. Were these going to be 16 programs? And the decision was there had to be one program, and they had to work together to prepare it. And that's what started cooperation between not only France and Belgium and Netherlands and countries that had been devastated by the war, but also Germany, if I believe. And I'd be more interested in how Germany was involved in their role in the development of that plan and in the Marshall Plan itself.
Right, well, at the time the Marshall Plan was being established, we were occupiers, and Germany was not an independent country. So when I mentioned the OEC, the U.S. actually was the representative. There was a U.S. representative representing Germany in that first year, but then, I'm not sure my dates, but after I think the first year, Germany did gain its independence, became an independent country again, West Germany, and it had its own representative on the OEC. But the way, the Marshall Plan worked both ways. It was a bilateral situation. Each country had a bilateral agreement. As I said, the State Department helped to craft with each country, making certain commitments that were, they all shared, I'm sure all the countries shared certain elements of the agreement, but certainly each country also had quite a few variations in their economies and had to make specific commitments to do certain things that were relevant to their specific economies. And then on top of that, you had the broader commitment that all the countries had to make, and that was kind of expressed through the OEC. And so there was you had the pressure that was being enacted bilaterally using the counterpart funds. That was on a one-to-one basis between the U.S. representatives of the ECA in the missions, working with each country. And at the same time, you had this overall kind of groupthink going on about dividing out the assistance. So and that was kind of worked. That was kind of influenced by the U.S. There was a major U.S. representative who was Averell Harriman, who was the representative in Europe for all of Europe, and so he was like working on the multilateral side. Yeah. Is that answering?
One more point. Similar to last year's AGM, we talked about congressional relations with the foreign aid program and how important it is to have folks on both sides. I think Senator Vandenberg, I believe from Ohio, a Republican, was the champion of the Marshall Plan, and he had done a tour in Europe and seen him by himself, for himself, the devastation, and was utterly convinced that to block further communism, the whole Senate had to support the program, and he basically, it was his leadership on the Hill that made the big difference in the funding levels also.
Absolutely. There's a quote. He worked so closely with the Truman administration. If I could find the appropriate quote that I did not share this morning, which was the Washington Post. Let's see. Vandenberg later said, in reference to the time he spent with Secretary Marshall crafting the program, he said, "We could not have gotten much closer unless I sat in Vandenberg's lap or he sat in mine." So, I mean, it was a very close relationship in crafting the program. And then also another factor in getting congressional approval wasn't just Vandenberg's visit to Europe, but they arranged for literally hundreds of members of Congress, especially, I think there were maybe 215 members of Congress went over to Europe prior to passage to see what the story was for themselves.
Jim, you have essentially 20 minutes left for
Okay,
questions and answers.
thank you.
Keep the questions short and try to get as many in
Okay,
as
good. Okay, the lady back here, and then I see we've got about half a dozen more. Yep.
Thanks, Diana Olbaum. And again, thank you for a fantastic panel. Like a lot of people in this room, I've been doing this for a very long time, and I learned a lot from all of you. I'm just wondering if your research has covered at all, to what extent this is unique to the United States. Were other countries also having foreign aid programs throughout their history and in these periods, or is this something that the U.S. was unique in doing? Thank you.
Other countries were providing foreign assistance. It depended on the country. I mean, a lot of times during the era of European imperialism, you actually see assistance staying within the empire. So the British Empire was often giving some assistance, though limited, to many of its colonies, for example. And so there was this sort of interesting, the way that imperial spaces worked that determined where aid was given. But a lot of industrialized countries were giving aid. After the formation of the Soviet Union, and really after World War II, you actually see the Soviet Union beginning to provide assistance, and the United States officials, as you might imagine, were worried about this. There's a lot of chatter. As you get into the 60s, 70s, you start to see a rise from lots of different countries as well. But so there are certainly there is a history of foreign assistance from other countries too.
I think
I take a somewhat different view of it. I argue in my work that foreign aid is really a unique American innovation. That's very different than what the Europeans did. And I think you see this in the 19th century in some of the nation-building efforts that were undertaken at that time. And I often compare it to the equivalent of the telegraph, the telephone, the internet. And it was the OECD and this very important innovation that came out of the Marshall Plan that Curt talks about that made foreign aid ubiquitous after World War II. It's so ubiquitous today that we often forget about how unique it was before World War II. It's not to say the Europeans and other countries did not implement specific types of assistance, but you don't see the democracy promotion, you don't see the nation building, or at least I haven't been able to see that. You see commercially driven assistance, access to resource-driven assistance. But efforts like were done with promoting the independence of Haiti, or developing Liberia, as morally repugnant as that may be to us today, or the development or the policy dialoguing of Henry Carey and the Careyites with Bismarck on the unification of Europe. or the team that went to Japan in the 1870s, sent by Ulysses S. Grant to support the restoration and nation building in Japan. You don't see that. I don't see that in other countries.
Thank you, John. Let's keep moving back and forth over here.
Hello, Carol Grigsby. To pursue a little bit further what might be unique in the American experience, when I worked for a time on the Hill, I was aware of a certain amount of lobbying that took place by hyphenated American groups for assistance, obviously, to their home country. And I just wondered what role some of you might think that immigration to the United States has played in terms of immigrant groups then turning around and lobbying for assistance. Thanks.
Good question. Curt, you want to, any comment on that one? We'll start with you.
I read a lot about during the Marshall Plan period in particular, I read a lot about what was happening in the United States, and there were interest groups, the women's voters associations and all this kind of stuff that rose up in favor of the Marshall Plan. But I can't think of the Irish Americans or any particular immigrant group that played a major role, which I'll have to go back and look because you would have expected that, I suppose.
Yeah, certainly in a lot of, so I'm working on a book right now on U.S. international disaster assistance. And so, when the earthquake I referred to in Italy, for example, you see Italian-American communities, which at that point is a very large immigrant population, being a major lobbying force for assistance within their communities, within churches, Catholic churches. And you see sort of similar patterns in a lot of other catastrophes as well. Depending on whether those groups have a large presence in the United States or not. So I do think that plays, yeah, I would agree that plays a major role.
So Cy Talbot.
When we consider the Marshall Plan, I don't think we should forget the U.S. assistance program under SCAP in Japan, which was quite active and very responsible for the reconstruction of the Japanese economy. But also I would contend that we should look at the Marshall Plan and SCAP as a lessons learned when we came out of World War I. And that is we imposed reparations on the German government, which over time through the 20s and into the 30s, I would urge that we see how Hitler rose in Germany and another war as part of history.
Thank you, Cy. Any comment on that?
No, I think that says, makes the right comment right there. Yeah.
Okay, let's bring back over here, down here on the front row, maybe. Why don't you go first?
I think this would be for Curt Tarnoff. With respect to country ownership.
Identify yourself.
I just did. John, you can't hear me.
There
John Erickson.
That's
Got it.
That's better.
Okay, Alex, thank you. But my question is really for Curt. With respect to country ownership, there's another aspect of country ownership, and I don't know whether it's apocryphal or not with respect to the Marshall Plan, but during the course of implementation, as is the case with all aid programs, bilateral, multilateral over the world, usually there's something like an annual review with the recipients. And the focus is usually on the performance of the recipient. I have heard it said that in the case of the Marshall Plan annual reviews, at least half a day was devoted to the recipients talking about and assessing the performance of the donor. If you have run into that, I would be interested, and it seems to me there's a lesson learned here for the donor community. Thank you.
I can't say that I've read about that at all. It may very well have happened. There's a big gap. We're talking about, I know a lot of people, Alex was asking me about this question of how all of this might apply to the study that you want to do on the history of USAID. And there's a lot of information at this macro level, and the Marshall Plan is a good example of that, of what happened between the countries and the broad agreements and all. But when you get down to the nitty-gritty of what happened, for instance, at these review meetings or what was going on with the money in the country. It's really hard to get that kind of information. And the only way you really get it is some of these very few firsthand accounts and oral histories that come out from the people who are actually in the field and in the missions talking about their experiences. The broad books and histories of the Marshall Plan kind of skirt over kind of the nitty-gritty details, which personally I find more interesting than anything else. And I hope that everybody takes advantage of these oral histories, because future historians will really, really need that material.
I have to reveal that my source is none other than Haven Norton,
Okay.
who led the
Right.
oral history program.
Okay.
So it must be impeccable.
I will tell his son Charles that. I think he knows. Okay, please.
Marilyn Zach, and you're getting all the questions on the Marshall Plan. I think it's a bit of a false narrative, or actual narrative, that the Marshall Plan was so successful. The reputation is because we spent a lot of money on PR, the films, everything that went on to publicize it. But you had countries such as Turkey, Greece, and somewhat Italy that really weren't successful. And that doesn't get passed on when everyone talks about the success of the Marshall Plan and the high expectations there are. Another part of my question is, you talked about the counterpart funds. Richard Bissell invented that. He put of the counterpart funds 5% off to the side, which is basically for the intelligence operations. And they were just overrun with funds. And that was the beginning of the funding of the CIA before they got the official funding from the U.S. Congress. The thing that they then used is for making sure that the Italian elections kept the communists out of power. There's all kinds of these relationships with the intelligence community, including Paul Hoffman going to the Ford Foundation and the Ford having a long intelligence operation as well. How do you view all of this and the relationship between aid, which we ended up, I know, being associated with the CIA, with the work that I did overseas?
Remember, this is being recorded.
I had given some thought to using that as one of the topics that I would mention. I don't have a whole lot of information on that. What I know about it is that there was 5% that was used for the operations of the ECA, the expenses and things like that. And I believe some of that did go to the CIA or whatever the predecessor was, for purposes there. But I'm not sure about the success that they had using that money. I think there have been questions raised about whether it really accomplished anything, or whether it was just some money that they needed without being visible. And I am, in any case, it could have been something that one takes as a lesson, because I know that the USAID has faced this issue as cover over the years, but I just didn't want to get into that. It is something that did happen.
I think we'll go into closed session later to discuss this one. Let's get one question there, we'll get one more here, and we'll get one more there and finish it up. Okay, Mike, you got just
Mike
introduce-
Crosswell. Just two quick comments on the Marshall Plan. One follows on Marilyn's comment, which is goals. And I think there's a huge difference between the goal of recovery, getting back to where you were, and the goal of development, which is getting to a place you haven't been before. And I think that raises issues then about lessons learned on the Marshall Plan. A second comment on economic impacts. I wouldn't pay much attention to the 5% of GNP. That's probably 20 to 25% of investment, which is what drives growth. And it's probably a much higher percentage of public investment. So I wouldn't take that criticism per se so seriously. Secondly, it says nothing about the impacts of the policy reforms. And those are arguably major drivers of growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I think we'll take Ned, or, okay, sir. Sorry, somebody else got the mic before you there.
Silver, thank you to the panel, which was excellent, and to Jim.
Two short questions. First,
If, yeah, we're okay, you're okay. Keep going.
okay. If you separate out the development part of USAID and set aside
The relief programs, how much of the previous activity of the predecessor agencies and governments before the Marshall Plan were actually development? Certainly Liberia, but I don't know if too much. We heard a lot about relief.
second part, if you look at the current USAID program, wouldn't you have to change the spelling of Marshall Plan?
Okay. All right, let's
Well,
at least focus on the first one. We
Yeah,
have to discuss the
with
second one.
regards to development assistance, Art, certainly development wasn't understood in the same way, and that's why it's hard often to go back and forth here. At the same time that we say that, certainly the work of Joel Poinsett in Chile in the 1810s, it was all focused on agricultural development, what we would today call governance, nation building, establishment of security assistance to permit investment. And there were a whole host of Americans that went overseas. Certainly the work of this mid-century economist who is virtually unknown, Henry Carey, who was called Lincoln's economist, who ends up advising Bismarck on the unification of Germany, who sends a team to Japan. All of that was focused on development. The whole team that went to Japan was infrastructure development. Now, it was technical assistance, it was mobilizing, it was institution building, it was the development of the Bank of Japan, so they could mobilize their own capital to fund much of the infrastructure work. It was a USDA team that went to Japan during that period of time. Anyone who's seen the movie of The Last Shogun, there's reference to that.
I think I would add too that you have to follow what you said, that development isn't necessarily understood as the same way with the same terminologies that would be post-45 in the late 20th century. But if you look back at the 19th century, the work of many American Protestant missionaries in China building schools and medical clinics, that's sort of considered a form of what we might sort of see as a parallel to development. Military occupations in Haiti and the Dominican Republic in the early 20th century were defined very much at the time as civilizing missions that were about building schools and roads. There are a lot of problems with these civilizing missions that we now, well, people at the time recognized, but we certainly recognize 100 years later. But so I think that the development was kind of part of it, even if it wasn't called that, but it's in sort of, you have to look for it in different spaces than you might, because there weren't these sort of official agencies, designated for development.
Thank you, Julie. Okay, last question.
I'm Kostas Michalopoulos. And my first...
closer to your...
I have a comment about the lobbies, the various lobbies affecting the aid. Have you ever heard about the Greek lobby? It actually had an impact for over a long period of years in terms of the amount of aid that was given to Greece relative to the amount of aid that was given to Turkey. 2-to-1 was the ratio. And it actually did a very good job in getting a lot of money for Greece and for Turkey, and they both did very well. The other comment is actually a question. With respect to the comment that was made about the Marshall Plan being conditioned on trade liberalization, I want to understand this very correctly, because what it meant is that, in fact, the United States was saying to the Europeans, you create preferences among yourselves, and that means that we would be discriminated in the European market for at least 50 years. Am I correct in this interpretation? Because what you now have is a situation that you have a new proposal that finally the United States would have the same access to the European countries as the European countries will have to the United States. This is the TTIP. Am I interpreting this correctly?
Well, my understanding is that they were focused on the intra-European trade, which there were high barriers between each of those countries. And so they lowered them by more than 50% by 1952, and even lower soon after that. So that was the concern.
But that meant that there was preferences among themselves against U.S. goods, right?
Well, they had been buying, the only source, at that time, I don't think that was an issue, because they didn't have enough dollars. That's why to buy U.S. goods. That's why one of the things the Marshall Plan did.
Okay.
So.
Thank you.
So we need to wrap this up on schedule, and which is unusual for us, but
Speak
but
for
I,
yourself, Jim.
Yeah, I just want to say that I want to thank the panel. We all do, for helping us to see the value of our history and giving us fresh ideas on what that means for the value of our future. And that's particularly on a number of our minds right now. For me personally, the closer I get to retirement, the more I appreciate history, because the more I'm becoming part of it. And just to get back to your original comment, Cy, to know what we've done is to know who we are. Everybody here should be awfully proud of themselves for the contributions you've made in the post-World War II period, primarily. And as the president said when he came to our building a few weeks ago, wear it with pride, own it. So thank you, panel. Thank you very much.
Jim and the panelists, thank you very, very much. There's obviously, we could carry this on for another several hours with very great rewards. And I think, Julia, you'll be staying around. And Curt, I don't know if you can stay around for a while. And John, of course, you'll be here. So I hope that you can follow through. Some of you who didn't get a chance to ask your questions, you can engage with them during the coffee break, which is now. And we're going to come back here at 11:30 on the dot. So if you start moving back in here at 11:25, that'll be good. But in the meantime, you can pepper your questions to Julia and Curt and to John. And thank you again very, very much for a great. Thank you all very much.